My name is Blair Williams, and I'm here today at the Second Presbyterian Church of Carlisle with Jacky Ferguson, and we're here to learn a little bit more about the building itself and the sanctuary. So, Jacky, could you tell me sort of a little bit about the history of how this building came to be?
When my husband was called to this church back in 1965, they had already started thinking about relocating, renovating the building they had. They needed to do something. And so we knew when we came there were decisions to be made. And my husband had asked the sessions to not bring that up until he had been here a while to get to know the congregation. Well, we came in October, and in January, one of the elders said, I move we start thinking about our future. And so the church spent 5 or 6 years studying the different options they had, and they broke the congregation into groups and went from zone to zone, educating the people about the different options so that it would be, they would feel included and having a part in the decision. And in the Presbyterian system, the congregation rules so that they get the vote on what you're doing. So we had many votes. And they eventually voted to relocate because there wasn't any room to expand where we were. And they already knew that there was no ground for activities or anything. And they decided to move out of town because First Pres was right up the street, and we were stepping on each other's toes, and we both congregations were too big to merge. They already had a parking issue, and so did we. So that didn't make sense. So we voted to relocate, and then a grounds committee was picked, and a building committee, and they looked at many properties. One of the major ones was where Thornwall Park is. And I know my husband envisioned a beautiful colonial church there because he had just come from, in his student years, pastored a brand new colonial church in New Jersey. So that was his vision. And then they found this property, which had actually been zoned for housing. And one family had already bought a lot. And so when this became the favored property, and I can honestly say I don't remember why it was. I think probably the amount of acreage, because they didn't want ever again to have the problem of being boxed in. And this end of town, because a study that they had made showed that this was going to be the fastest growing part, when in fact, the other end of town grew faster than this one. This one grew much later, this end. The north end seemed to have more building. And I remember different members who were farmers in the congregation thought this land was useless because the only thing it could be used for was grazing sheep because it was too rocky. But this was the land they decided to build on. I think it gave them more acreage on the end of town where they wanted, and without the congestion of Walnut Bottom Road, which wasn't near congested then, but anyhow. Then the building committee started looking at architects, and they looked at Gothic churches, traditional churches, colonial churches, which seemed to be very popular then. And somebody on the committee or my husband heard of this architect that had built a church in Downingtown. And so they looked into him, and I think even went and visited that church. And his name was Donald Dunkley, and he was from Bethlehem. And they invited him to come. And I can remember like yesterday when my husband came home, he said, that was really amazing. He came in and said, if you want a Gothic church or a traditional church or a Williamsburg church, there's a lot of good architects, but you don't want me. I only do contemporary. That's what I'm interested in. That's where my creativity and my excitement comes, and that's what. Well, he showed them things, and they went to visit some of his churches, and then they got excited. They kind of let go of their colonial image, and they just were excited about working with him. And he came and lived at this church for a month in our community, and he visited every organization in the church. He went to choir, he went to he went to session meetings, trustees meetings. He went to most any kind of meeting he would sit in on. He had lunch with groups. And he just wanted to know the congregation and wanted to know what was important to us and how we lived, how we worshiped, and that made a big impact, I think, on the congregation. And so we voted to hire him. And then he started the building. And he built a sample church and put it on display. Well, you cannot believe the critics. There was a lot, because I think a lot of the congregation had a traditional church in mind. But in the end, they voted to build this style. And it was the architect that decided where it would be placed. That was one of the questions. My husband always pictured, well, up on the flat part or down on the flat part, because that's where churches always are. And he said, you never use good land to put a building on. You use the unusual land to put the building on. So he picked the rocky part, which there was a lot of outcovering of Carlisle rock. And so this is where it was placed, and the lower classrooms went down over, there was a cliff-like, and so they go down over that to the flat part out there. And knowing the congregation, he knew that at that time we were an outdoor congregation. That was one of the reasons for moving, because they were landlocked. There was no land in downtown Carlisle. And we had started a youth group that by the time we came here, it had 75 coming every week. And the program had outdoor, when they came from school, they could play and have free time until all the students got here from the different school districts, and then the program would start inside. But at that time, they had recreation. They could either study or play soccer or capture the flag or whatever, and that was led by the pastors. So we knew we needed grounds, so that's the use of the ground was out there. And you know, people lived outdoors much more then, so there were many activities outside. So that's why it's placed where it is. The design, of course, was the architect's, and the shape of the sanctuary are supposed to reflect the arms of God. When you walk in, the arms of God wrapping around you. The windows are, you go from the outside, the blues and the greens from nature, that are big because you come from the outdoors, so you gradually come in from the outdoors, and then you focus on worship, and the colors of worship are the red and oranges, so that's why. And they get smaller because you don't focus on the windows, you focus on the sacraments, the worship. And that's why the pulpit, the communion table, and baptismal font, none of them are central, but they all are, because that's the center of our faith, the sacraments. And the pulpit, I think it asks why the pulpit is there, because in our tradition, the preaching of the word is very important. It's the word of God, and it's preeminent in the service. So it's high, but it's also a part of the sacraments. And the communion table was large because there were 12 disciples, so there should be room for them all at the table. That's pretty much did I miss any of the just general part? I don't know.
I think one of the other things on here is the location of the choir.
Because when the choir's up front, it looks more like they're entertaining, and the concept was that music is a very important part of this congregation. It always has been historically, and Dawn saw that. But their purpose is to support worship, and so they sit with the congregation, so that they're back there because they support us in singing, but they aren't up front entertaining. And also, they never sit with their families like the pastors never did. They were always set apart and segregated. And the concept of the congregation was we all worship together as families. So the choir, the anthem and everything were always designed so and spacious pews and leg rooms so people could move. Their families could move in and sit with them. They could sit nearby where the choir member could go sit with them. And they still do that to this day. You'll see movement after the anthem where they go sit with their families. So that was part of the reason. The size of the chancel is, when we moved here in the old church, a lot of innovations in worship were going on all around the country, and we had an interpretive movement choir, which was quite large, and they led in worship quite often, and actually became fairly well recognized in the Presbyterian church. They traveled Ohio, different churches. And in fact, our associate pastor that just retired was one of the original dancers in that interpretive movement choir. And my husband was interested in different forms of worship, types of worship, like drama and things like that. So he knew that he wanted lots of space up there. And the architect figured that out too, that the congregation was interested in innovative types of worship. So that's why the space down here and the chancel being elevated.
And then the organ and the pipes that are behind you.
They came from the old church. Now, they were refurbished, sent back to Muller, and we happened to have an organist at the time that worked at Muller, so he helped us a lot in getting it refurbished, and they added some pipes, and it's been refurbished a couple times since, and in those renovations, we got a new console. And in fact, I don't know the time, but it hasn't been too long ago. It was totally taken out and refurbished.
And then the cross.
The wooden cross up there actually was built for the old church. We had a Cuban refugee that the church had sponsored, and he wanted to make a thank you gift to the congregation, and the church had nothing up in the chancel, in the background. And my husband and I had just come from a church in Bucks County that had had a cross built for the same reason in the church. So my husband still had the patterns of that. So Louis decided he wanted to make a cross for this church. And so then when we moved, the idea was that cross would go on that big wall outside and hang on the outside of the church, because there was not going to be anything like that in the front here, because the architect had his own vision of fronts of churches. He said as a kid, he remembers sitting and counting knobs on pulpit chairs and looking at all of the furniture up there. He was always distracted by what was up there rather than worship, which I think most kids are. And so he would not be happy with that cross up there. But it couldn't stay outside because it wouldn't hold up in the weather. And so somewhere along the way, we had the cross hung, and the congregation had a chance to see it without the cross and with, and we took a vote. It was pretty divided, but it never came down. It's been there ever since. So. And now it's a part of the church, so nobody would want it. Yeah.
How much, how much explanation or selling did Don have to do to explain maybe his vision?
Well, he explained that mostly to the committee. Mm-hmm. You know, he was in the Air Force, I believe, and had an impactful spiritual experience. And he also was from the Reformed tradition, which is what we are. So he had a lot of understanding of the theology. But and I think the committee was excited by him, and the fact that he came and spent so much time. He became really linked to the congregation, so they were supportive of one another, pretty much.
You mentioned that a lot of people, when they initially saw the model, were a little bit taken aback. Was it the committee then that sold the congregation on the design?
I don't remember. The building was, the model was cork, so it was very dark, very drab. And of course, you know, you look at it and there's this round part, like the rotunda, and then this sweeping wall. And, you know, in a colonial town like Carlisle that was very conservative, and middle Pennsylvania, this was shocking. And it was shocking to the congregation, I think even in some ways to the committee, but they were excited about doing something new and expressing who we were at the time as a congregation, and our interests, and the excitement of doing something to move forward.
Before we get to some of the changes that have been made since it was initially built, I'm wondering what other areas or spaces were important?
Well, because we had this new program called Youth Club, there was a lot of focus on youth, the music and the youth. And so the outside was important, and then of course classrooms. The concept was that the upper level would be for the elderly and preschool, and the downstairs would be the more mobile part of the congregation. And at that time, the choir room was downstairs with their own robing and bathroom facilities and everything. And the rotunda, at the time, because I know our middle schools were built not long after that, and there was a lot of the same concepts in windows and stuff like that for the flow of heat and air and stuff. But the round building there was thought to be more practical for setting up tables and having large groups of people if you didn't have corners. The rounder the room, the more tables you could put in. And by the time the building was finished in 1971, we had like 150 youth eating every Wednesday night, so we had a lot of tables up and taking down stuff. So that was the concept. It was also part of culture at that time, more contemporary buildings and that type of look.
So I don't know if these are in sort of chronological order, but a few of the changes that I've seen are, there was an elevator that was added.
Mm-hmm.
When was that?
When was it?
Yeah.
I don't know, because we've had like 3 or 4 renovations, but we had a disabled young lady, and I think that, and we also had a teacher very active in youth work here, and still is active in the church, and he taught special needs outside the church, and I think it was obvious that we needed something to help people who were infirm up and down. And also the older people, even though they had a place upstairs, you know, they were very interested in what went down on downstairs. They wanted to get down there too. So I'm not sure what year that was added, but.
And is that where the downstairs, is that where the rotunda is?
Well, there's an upper rotunda and a lower, so
Okay.
That's the upper and downstairs. And the lower one downstairs was renovated just within the last 4 years, 3 or 4 years, modernized.
And then I see also I think you mentioned it earlier, the choir room has moved since the initial construction.
And one of the renovations, the offices were always down here. The main entrance was down here, and so the offices were down in this end, and they were very small. And that was during when my husband was still pastor. They moved the offices up here and built a gymnasium. It's now called an all-purpose room, but it was a room to play basketball, and that was also popular in the churches at that time, where, you know, if you couldn't be outside playing, we have a basketball court up there, but if it was inclement weather, when they came from school, they had this recreation time. And so there was a basketball was added to the gymnasium. Now I don't even know what it's called. It's gone to multi-purpose room to change its names, but it's still used, and now the choir meets in there.
Okay. And then portico was added? A portico?
Yes, out here. And that was, I think when the last pastor was here, that was added. It was flat in the front.
Okay.
And you can't imagine that there was a lot of people that were very against that. You know, nobody wants you messing with their church. And so there was a lot of objections, but it has been an amazing use, because we have so many people that are in wheelchairs, and so they can pull under that, and we have a valet service where we have men that volunteer. They'll take your car. If you still drive, but you'd rather not walk from the parking lot, they'll take your car and park it. And so it's wonderful in inclement weather. It's been great.
I don't know if I can pronounce this properly, but the narthex?
That's the narthex. This is the lobby. The one outside here is the lobby. And the narthex it's just a gathering place, and it's large because the concept is you gather people if they can stand around and talk. If they have to walk, our church downtown was, when you left the sanctuary, you were on the sidewalk.
Yeah, no. So you've mentioned that the building has undergone a few renovations. Is most of that just sort of updating, or?
Updating and maintenance.
Rather than specific, you know, I mean, the portico, I'm guessing, is addressing a specific need, but most of it.
Yeah, I'm not the best one to answer that, but, you know, like there was some serious issues with electrical things, and heat pumps and, a lot of that type of stuff had to be dealt with that nobody sees but needed upgrading. And then the downstairs rotunda went through a major renovation for a center for the youth would have their own space. And there was a little kitchenette added, and there's classrooms around it, which there always were, but it was just certainly modernized and brought up. But, it's been 40-some years.
Yeah.
Things
It's
change.
what, 72?
We moved in September of 71.
Okay.
And so that's just been renovated in the last 5 years, so it was over 40 years, so.
Yeah. And then, well, I know a few people have mentioned, almost, a year later after you move in, Hurricane Agnes, everything is flooded.
72, mhm.
How-
6 months after we moved.
Was it? What was that like?
Awful.
Yeah.
Our section was downstairs, it was the week of Bible school, and it rained every day. And he was downstairs vacuuming after Bible school, and the carpet started. And within almost no time at all, the water was almost halfway up the stairwell. You would see out in the hallway. And so they put out a call, and people came running, and we moved pianos, and we had a nursery school. Well, I'm not sure it was here yet, but we had another flood. Not quite that bad, but moving all of the furniture and all of the materials that the school used, getting that out of the way, and Bible school. Bible school was going on, so all of that the equipment that they were using had to be moved and rescued. So that was on a Friday, Thursday or Friday. And we had no electricity, nothing. But we had worship out on the patio that Sunday morning.
Have there been any other sort of eventful or instances of the building along the
You mean negative things or
positive?
I think the positive things, and the thing somebody asked me not long ago, is why did the church buy so much property? We have 10 acres. And I said, well, first of all, it was sold. It came that way, at 10, and I think also because you never know what the future is, and they didn't want to be landlocked again. And also, the life of the culture was much more outdoors. So we used the front lawn was, anytime you would drive back, there would be kids out there playing soccer or football or volleyball. And when the church had picnics, they would use that there. We had luau's and a lot of social events out on the major patio down here, more so than up here because it's not as much room. But we had a lot of events down. Everything was outdoors, strawberry festivals. The only time we were indoors was if it rained. And then coffee hour on Sunday morning would be out on the patio. And now that never happens, it's in here. Because people stay inside now. So it's interesting to see how the culture changes the use of the church.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, the church's physical structure is also adapted to meet those new needs.
It's made of people, so.
Yeah. Is there anything else that we should focus on? Or?
I don't know, I haven't looked at my. Oh, the decision why there are no flags? I don't know if that was Mary Jane's question or just the people see that. And that's been an ongoing discussion in churches forever, because a lot of churches have them. We always had them. We're Reformed tradition, so we don't necessarily have other things in the sanctuary that don't have anything to do with our worship, but also having an American flag. The Christianity is an inclusive religion. We include all nations, all peoples. So if you have one flag, you're sort of not witnessing to what you believe. And then there was always the argument which flag should be prominent. The national flag, which in the United States, it's always prominent. It has the place of honor. But in the church, we recognize God as the overall leader, so the Christian flag should be the prominent. So, it just adds attention that, and I think the overall feeling is there's no need to have flags in a place of worship. And we do have them, they do come out to honor veterans and Veterans Day, and I believe Memorial Day, and significant patriotic days. They still are displayed.
Probably the one thing I should ask in terms of what we're discussing, the symbols and whatnot. Could you just describe sort of, the cross is a little bit different in the Presbyterian church here than in other churches. Could you sort of describe that, or?
That cross?
Yeah.
And that's the Celtic Cross,
okay,
which is the home of Presbyterianism in Scotland, and that's the symbol from the Celts.
Okay.
So.
Yeah.
And then actually the banners are new. A woman in the church gave those in honor of her husband, and the cross and the symbol of the dove, which is the symbol of the Holy Spirit. And the windows are supposed to be deciphered by your own worship experience and whatever you see in them. So.
Now, are the lights original, or were those added?
The lights are original. They've been worked on a lot over the 40-some years, because they were designed originally, the bulbs that they were designed for were no longer made, so that presented a huge problem. So our trustees always had a lot of work to do. And they just changed some last night, so you can imagine it takes a magnificent ladder.
Yeah.
The men were in here last night changing light bulbs and hanging banners.
And then, does the roof signify anything, or is that just acoustics?
And the organist at the time was just, couldn't believe they were going to put carpet in, because evidently carpet really does something to the acoustics of an organ. But it's a cement floor.
Yeah, well, I know it probably dampens the sound a little bit.
But if you'd hear them play it, it never sounds dampened.
No.
It's quite huge. And the pews have unusual amount of room for the legs, so there could be movement in and out. We had, historically, we had a lot of drama, a lot of religious drama.
Just regarding movement, or drama regarding people moving in and out of pews, or?
They could. To participate in something that out of the ordinary. And also because we have choir members and people moving, that they can sit with family.
Well, just in terms of how many people can the sanctuary hold?
500,
Oh, wow.
maybe 6. I know we've had 600, but there was probably some chairs added.